Okay, good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. I hope those who've returned back to college and university have remained safe and healthy. Today's talk is by Gautam Rao, and John will give the introduction to Gautam in a second. I just want to say this is like the penultimate Advances of Field Experiments seminar before our conference. So we have the Advances of Field Experiment Conference on September 23rd, 24th. I'll send a link to that conference in the chat box in a second. We've got three great keynote speakers of Oriana Bandiera, Larry Katz, and Ulrika Mamandier. We have quite a few panels on methods and gender discrimination and how to publish in the top six. So hopefully I'll also see you all there, and I'll hand it over to John for the intro.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. I hope all are well and safe and healthy. So I have the pleasure to introduce Gautam. And I would say of all the things I think about Gautam, he is probably the one who I would say got away. And what I mean by that is, so I've known Gautam now for close to 10 years. I met him when he was a graduate student at Berkeley. And he was working with Stefano and Ulrike, and he was helping us on a project on charitable giving. And every time Gautam would talk or give us his insights, I was always of the mind like, wow, who is this guy? He's talking to us like he is a full-fledged colleague. And that's essentially how good Gautam was back then. And he's progressed, of course, quite a bit since then. But we ended up working on a paper on gender. We worked on a voting paper. We're working on a gift exchange paper now, on an environmental paper. And Gautam is a scholar who is really quite unique and rare in that he brings together three, I think, very important features that very, very few colleagues of mine or researchers who I know actually can bring together. One is he's super creative, and I think you see that running through all of his work. The second is that he's very disciplined in his way in which he uses models to think through not only how to design an experiment or to design a data set, but also using that model as a lens into what the data are teaching him. And then third, he's just incredibly hard worker. And these three traits or features, characteristics of Gautam, I find is quite rare. And he brings all these together to answer really important economic questions. And one such question we'll be talking about today is how research affects policy. So before I let him go here, he's the one who got away because I worked, as my colleagues at University of Chicago know, and everyone else probably around the world knows, to hire Gautam when he came out on the market. I think he graduated 2014 or so, went to Harvard from there. The package that I put together for Gautam was Michael Kramer-like. And of course, we got Michael Kramer. I'm happy to say about a month ago, I told everyone that we're recruiting Michael Kramer, and we ended up getting him. I tried super hard, of course, with Gautam. The fight's not over, but Gautam, welcome. And it's always a pleasure to see you and to call you my friend. So go ahead, Gautam. And also Diana is on the call, and she'll be answering any questions that you have as Gautam proceeds. So Diana, welcome as well.
So I've never quite had an introduction like that before in a seminar. I think all of you have to make up for it by pounding us even more on the paper with your questions, because otherwise I might die of a swollen head. So thanks so much, John, for the kind words, John and Rob for the invitation. This is joint work with Diana Moreira from UC Davis, who's here with us today, and Jonas Hjort at Columbia, and Juan Santini, who's a terrific postdoc at IPA, who couldn't be with us for the presentation. So One motivation for this work is the observation that there's really been an explosion of policy evaluation research in social science in the last few decades. But there's sort of this looming question in the hearts of those of us who do this work and in the hearts of some of our critics, which is, do policymakers actually value such information? Does encountering such research actually shift their beliefs? And if in fact it does this translate into new action? That is, does this actually affect policy choices? And how does all of that depend upon aspects of the research? For example, its internal versus external validity. That's the thing many of us have sort of worried about, talked about in my field of development economics. There's been a lot of discussion around this, but also on the characteristics, incentives, and the prior beliefs of the policymaker themselves. Perhaps in a sort of less navel-gazing sense, if we don't worry so much about does science affect policy, we can still ask more broadly, what are the barriers to the adoption of effective or cost-effective policies in government? Are information frictions important in practice? So those could be frictions between research and policy. They could be frictions between different actors within government, for example, between politicians and bureaucrats. Or instead, are the barriers exclusively other factors like political incentives, agency issues within government, or things like technical capacity? And sort of, we're going to try to make one small step towards answering these questions by presenting you with two experiments with municipal officials in Brazil. The first experiment is with about 760 municipal officials. About half of them are mayors, the rest are municipal council members and secretaries. And it's sort of what you might call a lab in the field experiment. What we're going to randomize is the particular study that we are going to sort of present policymakers with. And these are studies which have used RCTs to evaluate early childhood development programs. And we're going to elicit the policymakers' willingness to pay to learn the sort of simplified bottom line finding from these papers. Then we're going to measure what's the causal effect of learning the answer on their beliefs about how effective an ECD program would be in their own municipality. And we're going to study how this varies with attributes of the studies that we've randomly offered to the policymakers, as well as, in a correlational sense, how this varies with attributes or characteristics of the policymakers themselves. That's going to be one experiment. I'm going to refer to it as the beliefs experiment. The crucial thing here is a careful measurement of prior beliefs about effectiveness, this willingness to pay measure about learning the new information, and then how your posterior belief changes. But this experiment will not tell us anything really about does this translate into some change in the real world. So we have a complementary experiment, which is sort of a large-scale field experiment with about 1,800 recently elected mayors across Brazil, where the treatment will be to provide them with or invite them to an information session where we're going to provide them with research findings about a particular, highly effective, low-cost policy. And that policy is reminder letters to get, local taxpayers to pay their taxes. And we're going to see how providing them this information affects actual policy adoption about, 1.5 to 2 years later. So this experiment is going to sort of be a bit more focused on slightly longer run effects, and it's going to be more focused on actual policy adoption.
Gautam, quick question. So this is wonderful. It strikes me that some policymakers are nervous about small scale or petri dish results that might not scale. And number one is primarily, to me, a question about, we have some early childhood results. I've worked in that area, as you know, many other people on the call have too, that are in the petri dish and they might not scale. And then you go, so I don't know if you ask questions about scaling, we'll find out. But then your example is something that doesn't have any of the elements, what I call the Anna Karenina problem with scaling, that you would have in number one. So feels like there's this fundamental disconnect between the most important things in one and what you're doing in two. Maybe you can help us along with that.
Yeah, so this is going to show up exactly in our surveys of the mayors. You know, one of the crucial things we're going to be varying, or that the different studies varied in this first experiment, is the sample size. And we're going to, the scale at which this thing was implemented or evaluated. And we're going to talk about that and about, how much and whether policymakers value that. There is a disconnect, John, you're right, between experiment 1 and experiment 2. We'll return to that. Part of the answer to that is actually this experiment 2 was run before experiment 1, even though I'll present them in reverse order. And it was running experiment 2 that bought us the political capital to be able to run experiment 1. So, some of this is managing a partner and so on. But I'll return to the gaps between these two experiments later in the talk. But the thing about scale, sample size of the study, potential publication bias, things like that, that's certainly going to show up in experiment 1. And you're right, in experiment 2, we are providing people with, so the study you did was, 200,000 people were, in your experiment on reminder letters. And a lot of the work on this topic was, in area 2 was sort of larger scale. There were 12 RCTs. The evidence seemed relatively robust. That was partly why we were more comfortable and our partner was more comfortable presenting that evidence. But we'll circle back, I think, in discussion to what are the gaps in the logic that come from having these two experiments. Okay. So, but I think this is going to show up and it certainly matters.
Thanks.
Okay. So just some context on Brazil for you guys. So work is in municipal governments in Brazil. The executive is headed by an elected mayor who in turn appoints the secretaries, sort of the key bureaucrats, the secretaries of finance, education, etc. Mayors serve at most 2 consecutive terms, so they're term limited in their second term. They're highly autonomous and responsible for the execution of many key state functions. Our experiment is going to touch on 2 of those: compliance with local taxes and early childhood development programs. Now, the reason we're able to do this, and we think it would be great if more researchers sort of partnered with organizations like this. We're partnering with a nonpartisan confederation of municipal governments. And the really useful thing they do from our perspective is they organize a number of conferences each year, some of which are attended by thousands of mayors and their staff. So that means instead of, Brazil is a gigantic country, working across 1,800 municipalities in Brazil would be extremely difficult. We are able to actually sort of get face-to-face in some sense with these mayors by taking advantage of these conferences. So kind of that's how we're able to do this. Just because it's a short talk, I'm not going to say too much about relevant literature, but particularly I'll flag that research on beliefs of policymakers and beliefs of experts and information provision experiments, these are extremely active areas of research in economics. But outside of economics particularly, there's also a lot of work on the science policy interface, which we're trying to contribute to. So let's get into this beliefs experiment. So this was done at a bunch of different regional conferences and some national conferences. So we're across a large part of Brazil, but not quite everywhere. About half of our participants are mayors. About 20% are term limited. And about 90% of our participants are male, on average about 50 years old, and about 60% of them have a college degree. So that's what mayors and senior bureaucrats in Brazil are like, by and large. There's some variation, by the way, in whether these folks have already implemented some form of early childhood development program in their own municipality. So about 40% have, and another 25% are aware of, have heard about these programs, but haven't actually done them. Okay, so how does this experiment work? Just some setup at first. We're going to explain to them what we mean by early childhood development programs, and I think importantly, provide an example of a well-known program in Brazil. We do quite a lot of work to explain to them the outcome measures that these papers have typically looked at, which is test scores, sometimes called cognitive skills, And I think importantly, explaining the units in which those are measured, because standardized effect sizes, which is often what papers look at, is not necessarily how policymakers think. So we try and explain those things well. We try to provide some benchmarks for them. For example, in terms of standardized effects, test scores, how much do test scores increase with 1 year of education in Brazil in the cross section? So we give them some benchmarks, so the numbers make sense to them. I'll say that the experimental currency that people can choose to spend in this experiment is not going to be out of a municipal budget. It's not even really directly out of their pocket. So what it is we endow them with lottery tickets, which pay off for a free trip to the US. We're going to later do an exercise to show you how much that's worth in dollars to people. But that's what that's kind of the incentive to participate in some sense, as well as the experimental currency. Okay, here's how the experiment itself works. We're going to first elicit their prior beliefs about the likely effect size of these early childhood development programs. So we're going to ask, if this was done in your municipality, what do you think the effect would be, if you implemented this? And we also ask, this was done in this country or in this state and was evaluated there, what do you think they found? Okay, and that latter we can even incentivize, we vary the incentives. It doesn't really matter. I think people do their best to try to guess these things. And then here's where the randomization comes in. We're going to pick one of, so at this, when we did this study, 4 or 5 years ago, we tried to do a lot of work looking in different areas, figuring out where can we find comparable papers. We'd already done the tax thing for the other experiment, so we couldn't quite do it here. So what we picked were these 4 studies, which we didn't label as being small sample or large sample or being from a developing country or rich country. We just randomly picked one of them and offered it to participants, saying where it was done. 2 of these were done in developing countries, in Jamaica or in Colombia, and 2 were done in the US. And we also told them what the sample size was. So 2 of them we're going to refer to in the study as small sample, about 130 people, and 2 as larger sample, 1420 or 4,700 people. Okay, those of you who know this literature also know that the larger sample studies, happen to find, or perhaps for good reasons, found smaller effects. So we're going to pick one of these, offer it to you. And what does it mean to offer it to you? We're going to elicit your willingness to pay using a BDM method. So how many of your lottery tickets are you willing to pay to learn what the bottom line effect size was from the study? Of course, in principle, these guys could have gone and looked up the studies themselves. I think there are language barriers, there are technical barriers, but you should think of this as being your willingness to pay for, look, here's the bottom line, simplified, here's the finding, okay?
Gautam, may I ask a question about why do you offer only one of the 4 randomly rather than just give them like the full suite of the 4 and get their willingness to pay across all of them?
We're going to do that in the next round, actually. We wanted to have something that's both between and within, or so great question. We thought the same. So conditional on your willingness to pay, there's actually then going to be a random variation in whether you get to see the study or not. Okay. So we're going to be able to tell you what's the effect of seeing these things without selection in terms of your willingness to pay. But okay, so now you've seen the study. Now a few minutes later, we're going to elicit your posterior belief, okay, which is saying, well, now what do you think the effect would be if you did it in your municipality, right? And okay, now I wasn't going to get into this much, but we essentially do what Rob said, which is the 3 remaining studies, we present them and get willingness to pay for all 3 of them, implement one of them. And again, I won't get into this, but at the end of the whole thing, we offer you, again, with a new budget, we let you purchase a practical implementation information, like how do you actually go about doing these ECD programs? And in fact, we find effects on this, but I won't talk about it today. So first, let me tell you about willingness to pay. So on average, our participants were willing to pay about 45 lottery tickets, with a lot of heterogeneity, but I think 98% would pay some positive number of lottery tickets to find out bottom line effect size from the RCT. We did a separate exercise where we essentially let them use these lottery tickets to buy what are effectively like Amazon gift cards, which suggests that this is equivalent to about $36. So they're willing to pay about $36 out of their pocket, or out of this at least endowment that they were given to learn the result. Now, is this a big number? Is this a small number? It's hard to quite say. I'll just reveal that my fear and prior was that these guys would say, hell no, why would we pay? Like, people in experiments are often unwilling to kind of pay for information. Here we find what looks like, some demand, $36. Now, I think more interestingly.
Gautam, quick question.
Yes.
So do you think if it wasn't their money, they would have paid anything? It just feels to me like this is, the guy just gave us some money, he's nice, and I'm going to use part of it to give back. At least that's what all the environmental economics literature would say back to the early 70s.
Yeah.
When you do this sort of thing, what do you
yeah,
think?
so, I feel it could go either way. So if you're paying out of your municipal budget, if you do want to pay, you can certainly pay a lot more than $36. So that's, one thing. But there are plenty of other important uses of your municipal budget, and this may absolutely not rise to the top, of the pile. And in fact, we don't think municipalities in Brazil are spending a bunch of money, hiring consultants who are providing them with academic studies. So I think that's certainly something to worry about. I think we're thinking of this. Actually, there's two things in what John said. One is, demand effects. Just that, look, it's weird, it's an experiment, they're giving me some lottery tickets, I'll spend it. But the other is what we may really, I think what we may really care about is, would policymakers spend on this out of a municipal budget, which we definitely don't know.
Yeah, and the other thing that I meant with the comment was, did they not know about this information before? So do they invest $36 in journal subscriptions, or is it something that, like, why isn't this already in the market? Is it some kind of asymmetric information problem, or is it truly?
Yeah. So we think one thing that we learned in piloting is that a lot of policymakers, these mayors in Brazil, have no idea that any of this stuff even exists. Like, it's not some, just even knowing, so I think that there's going to be a question looming from our results, which is, well, what's the market failure? Like, why, if people seem to value this, if it changes their beliefs, if they even, as we see in the second experiment, take some steps towards changing policy, then why don't they already know this? I think in developing countries, one thing that's missing is this thick market for intermediaries that we have here in the US, where you have think tanks, you have all these. You even have popular news websites, and even the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal report academic articles a lot. This is not something that's very common in developing countries. And, we generally tend not to have all that many sort of valued think tanks. So there's some market for, in between that's missing. Why that's missing is an important question to understand better. But in practice, we think many of these policymakers do not actually know that there is this useful stuff out there. And then even if they knew it, some of them report just technical capacity barriers to understanding the research. There's also language barriers, but our academic papers are full of jargon, and these guys don't really have the staff to make sense of these things. So I think that's what's going on. That's sort of eliding. Eliding, is that a word in English? Rob, I'm looking at you.
I don't think so.
Damn it. Okay. I'm still gonna guess it's I'm gonna say eliding, a word I made up. I think it's still eliding the deeper question of why these things, why these markets don't exist. But we think that's a fascinating question to study.
Just on these regressions, Gautam, it's really interesting that they do value the larger studies. Between the larger and the smaller studies, was all else held equal?
No, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to try to, exactly. So here's the cleanest experiment we could have done, which, we thought would have been kind of deceptive. So we could make up studies and basically say, look, a study was done, we randomized the location, randomized the sample size, or less deceptive but kind of weird, tell them, we got the original data, it was for thousands of people, but we'll tell you the result of only 300 of them, or so we could have tried to keep it really, really clean. Instead, we chose to just use real studies, and we are interpreting this through the lens of large sample, small sample, developing country, not, but that surely could be correlated with other aspects and attributes that people may, they may say, oh, well, it's a large sample study, it must be better in some other way, or, we're going to come to that in a bit, but that absolutely is something you should worry about. So I told you that people are spending about, willing to pay about $36. But I think more interestingly, they seem responsive to whether it was a large sample study or not, right? The two larger sample studies, they're willing to pay more for than the smaller sample studies. So this is exactly contrary to my prior when we did the experiment. And again, contrary to my prior, they were not willing to pay more for the Colombia and Jamaica studies than they were for the US studies. Now, so of course, what's missing here is we don't have a study that's from Brazil itself. So maybe they think Colombia, Jamaica, these are all already like, sufficiently invalid that, that the difference between that and the US is small. But at least this was not our prior, okay? I'm going to return to, how much more should they be willing to pay for large sample studies, and also try to answer John's question there. So in the paper, we set up a very simple, normal Bayesian learning framework. I'm not going to work through it in the talk. On average, the belief updating fits pretty well with that Bayesian framework. People seem to put weights on their priors and their, the study finding that sum up to 1. What this graph is plotting is on the y-axis, how much you updated, your posterior minus your prior. And on the x-axis, how much news there was, how much of an information shock there was from the study finding, the signal minus prior, right? And so reassuringly, if your prior was 0.25, 0.2, and the study was 0.2, you don't change your posterior much. But if you got a positive signal, you update upwards. You got a negative signal. By signal, I mean the informative content of the study relative to your prior. You update downwards. In a Bayesian learning model, this thing should be pretty linear. That's kind of what it is. Weights sum up to 1. That's so that's what we find. So essentially, I'm not going to show you the tables here, but they're placing about 35% weight on the study and about 65-70% weight on their prior when they're forming their posterior belief. I should say we do things like give incentives to accurately get, we can never incentivize your belief about the effect in your own municipality because who knows what the truth is. We can incentivize, your predictions about effects in Colombia and Jamaica and the US, and we vary the size of those incentives and so on, and findings are very robust to that. Okay. So that was on average. I was showing you bin scatters, but actually there's a lot of heterogeneity at the individual level. So there's about a quarter of participants who just don't respond. That is, they stick with their prior. We don't think this is a mere lack of attention or blazing through it. We don't have evidence that that's what's going on. But there are some policymakers who are like, no, I think this is what it's going to be, and I don't care what it is in Jamaica or Colombia or the US. This is still my belief. But there is a lot of heterogeneity in how much weight these guys are placing. So on the, what's on the x-axis here is essentially how much weight you're placing on the study finding when updating your belief. Okay, and there's some people that are doing things that are clearly odd, contrary to at least simple versions of Bayes' rule, that is negative updating. That is, I thought 0.2, you told me 0.3, and I went to 0.1. And some people who overreact. Okay. Just like I showed you, people are willing to pay more for large sample studies than small sample studies. They also update more based on large sample studies than small sample studies. Okay, so that's what you'd expect. If you're paying more for it, precisely, if you're paying more for it because you think it's more informative, then you should also place more weight on what that study found. Okay, and that's what we find here. I'm not going to show you the tables, but these things are statistically quite significant. But for developing country versus rich country studies, there's no difference. You paid the same and you update the same based on them. I thought this was sort of so fascinating because in development economics, we've been having such an, such a vigorous debate about external validity and, can you learn something from a study in India about what would work in, Brazil? Of course, what I'm showing you today is not at all normative. We don't know what the true external validity is, but just purely descriptively, we're finding, at least between Jamaica, Colombia, and the US, these policymakers are not distinguishing much. By the way, it's also clearly not the case that they think this is all useless, because in fact, on average, they are updating quite a lot. Okay, now the question that Rob, and actually relates to also what John asked earlier, why are they preferring something like large sample studies? So we debrief participants and give them a bunch of options and also let them give free form answers. And sort of to our surprise, something like 60% of them say something that could be broadly construed as being about the precision of the estimates. So, they're of course not using technical terms like standard errors, but there's something about the larger sample giving more precise results that is in their minds and is why they're preferring the larger sample study. But exactly as you guys were guessing, there are other things they also infer. For example, 23% of them, at least, are inferring from the larger sample study that the implementation itself was at a larger scale. Okay, and 15% are inferring that, gee, if the study was, 4,000 students, this must have been done by the government and not some sort of dinky pilot program done by researchers. So that's part of why they are valuing the large sample study more. And we're not able to, in some sense, it was true the larger sample studies were in fact, more likely to be sort of implemented at larger scale. And people are inferring that from the large sample. But it's still the case that by far the largest sort of share of them say precision or something like precision.
Gautam, were you able to see whether like reputation and the quality of the research and people's beliefs of that might have been different between the large and the small studies, but also the developing and developed studies?
Sorry, so you're saying that people think that, so for example, in the US, the study was probably done better, for example.
As in, like, there might be, more resources put to the larger studies and they're more likely to be in the developed world.
So that's right. So there could be two things going on. You could think, look, the US is less externally valid for me in some sense, but the study was probably better. There could be these countervailing things going on. So we don't capture that. I guess we do have these similar debriefing questions for the people who preferred the US study. So interestingly, equal shares of people report, people, as we showed you, people don't pay more for the US study. So when you ask them about which of these, we have some other questions I haven't put here on, which of these is more valid for you, which is more informative for your research. We try to ask them sort of a holding all things equal, very hypothetical question. Which of these would be more informative for you? And interestingly, in Brazil, about half the people said the US would be more informative and half said the others. So this may be something special about the US. If we ask them about Finland, or Denmark or something, they might not say that. So the US may play a special place, have a special place in people's minds when they're learning about this stuff. And in fact, I think in Brazil, it's also not crazy that some mayors see themselves as closer to the US, economically or, in some sense than to Jamaica. So that may be part of what's going on. But I think, broadly, we do worry about these correlated factors. Okay. So yeah, so to answer John's question, the scale of implementation does come up. It's not the most common answer. It's not the, it's 23% of people bring it up as a reason to care about large sample studies. So, some people care. Maybe it's not an overwhelmingly at the top of their minds.
Yeah, Gautam, just to make the point, I think precise estimates would be couched in whether it scales or not. So I don't know, I would sum those and say a lot, there's probably some overlap in the two, but a lot of people care about whether it's going to manifest itself in my setting. That's a combination of an inference problem and whether it's going to scale. So I take a little issue with that last sentence. I don't.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Precision is not a right. We're not asking them the standard error of the mean. It's so that's right. So when they say precision, that could include some of these other things. I agree. Yeah. Okay. So I should hurry up a little bit. I'll say one thing, which is we can't quite directly test a Bayesian learning model, but we're able to actually say how much a Bayesian should respond to the large versus small samples, like the ratio of their responsiveness turns out to be pinned down by the ratio of the sample sizes. And in fact, by applying that benchmark, our participants are less sensitive, substantially less sensitive to sample size than a Bayesian learner should be. So, this could be because they overweight the small sample studies and they should in practice be much more skeptical of them. That's my guess of what's going on. Or they underweight the large sample studies, but we can't really distinguish which of these it is. The factors that John was talking about, like large scale implementation, those should, you would think if you value this, those should go even more in the direction of being sensitive to sample size. And we're saying that even forgetting that, just by Bayes' rule, people are not quite reacting enough to sample size. So there are some other things. We have some tests of motivated reasoning in the paper, and we just do not find evidence of it. So particularly, there's some work arguing that policymakers may exhibit asymmetric updating. If you give them good news, they get excited about it, and bad news, they kind of neglect. We don't find any evidence of that. We also don't find evidence of confirmation bias, which is if I get messages that are like my prior, I believe them and otherwise discard them. We don't see any evidence of that. I think a lot of that literature has been with MTurk samples or, without much incentives, and we don't have much evidence from, important decision makers. And at least in this sample, we don't find evidence of those kinds of biases. So, I think in this study, I've shown you, we've tried to show that people seem to value evidence and update their beliefs substantially. They seem to care some, at least, about sample size, but not about the variation in external validity that we at least had in our study, or plausible variation. But there are many important caveats. The willingness to pay, as I said, is not out of the municipal budget. There may be some demand effects and the like, although the choices, I should say, everything was kind of private. People did this on a tablet by themselves. But most importantly, perhaps there's no evidence that, these beliefs effects may just fade away, and there's no evidence that this matters for anything important. And that's what the second experiment is going to try to make some progress towards. So this was run at a conference where thousands of mayors who've just been elected or re-elected show up, and it's a huge conference. There's many parallel training sessions going on. Mayors also use these 2 or 3 day conferences to network and conduct a bunch of meetings. So what we do is we invite about 900 of these participating mayors to an information session. Okay, and we're going to cover about half the municipalities in Brazil. So our treatment is an invitation. So this is an encouragement design to a session where findings from research on tax compliance will be shared. So mayors are invited by SMS and by email, but note that we often had, incorrect, incomplete contact information, things would bounce. We aren't sure if people read the emails and so on. And of course we can't enforce participation. It's their choice to come or not. So the information session itself was a 45-minute long session on how to increase, tax compliance. And there was a presentation made by, a good presenter with a pretty nicely professionally produced policy brief that they could take away with them, all based on randomized impact evaluations. And here's what that looked like, one of the information sessions, so you can tell at least someone showed up. So the researcher, so anyway, so of course delivered in Portuguese and so on by local staff. So what is the information we're giving them? We're telling them about papers evaluating these reminder letters. So these are letters mailed to taxpayers before taxes are due, or after they've missed a payment, and before they have some deadline for paying again. And at that time, it had been evaluated in 12 RCTs, including evidence from Latin America. And I think those papers, most of us would have at least then said, were sort of surprisingly effective. Now we kind of know about these results more, but across the papers, different papers have slightly different kinds of outcomes. It's a bit hard to do an apples to apples comparison, but our best attempt was saying something like an average of 10 or 12% effects on compliance, improvements in compliance across the studies. And the strongest effects, which Holsworth et al., which includes the notorious duo of Rob and John, found was using this social norming language that is saying 90% of your neighbors pay their taxes on time, don't be the one person who doesn't do that. Also telling people about the possibility of being fined or audited, and even simply just telling them what the due date is. Different papers have found these things to be effective in inducing compliance. So this is what we told people about, and we even gave these mayors sort of, here's a template, here's an example of what a letter would look like. Your municipal tax payments are due on this date. Vast majority of your neighbors will pay their taxes on time. There's a risk of audit, so on and so forth. Okay. And then we send them away. I should say, why did we choose tax reminder letters? So 90% of municipalities raise some sort of local taxes. Compliance is an issue. Reminder letters are not a crazy intervention to suggest to them. About 30% of the control group, as we show later, actually use some version of reminder letters or tax due letters already. None of them are using things like social norm language to begin with, or very, very few are. But very explicitly, we are aware and chose this as what might be a best case. Okay, it's a best case partly because there's a very low upfront financial cost. Our treatment is a 45-minute long information session. My prior strongly was ain't nothing going to happen. Okay, so we're doing something that's very simple to implement, although I will caution that in many municipalities or even states in developing countries, even doing a mail merge and sending out letters on time is not an absolutely trivial activity. So it's not quite as simple to implement as we would imagine in rich countries. As John said, I guess the evidence base for this research comes from large sample, pretty compelling studies. Even so, these studies may be wrong, maybe these effects go away, there could be many shortcomings, but we wanted to pick something that we felt comfortable telling people works. And these are studies where the sample sizes are in the hundreds of thousands in some of them. So we're getting rid of, I tell you about a small study that found an enormous and perhaps implausible sample size. That's not in this treatment, and that is part of the gap we have from the from the other experiment I showed you. So this I love showing this map just because I think it's so impressive. So we have such a large part of Brazil covered. Things are very nicely balanced. So our first attendance, first outcome is attendance. So remember, we just invited people to attend. There was some opportunity cost of attending. There were other sessions they could have attended. I think even more likely what they mostly would have been doing would be networking, schmoozing. Despite this, close to 40% of the treatment group attended the session. Okay, so we had dreamt of like 75% and feared 0%, and we end up somewhere in between. So who attends? So at the individual level, the strong predictors are mayors with college degrees are more likely to attend, and younger mayors are more likely to attend. In contrast, something like term limits, that is, will you get to run again, or even how competitive your last victory was, these things don't predict your participation. Neither do a range of municipality level characteristics, which I won't show you. Okay, but younger and more educated mayors are more interested in this opportunity. Now, how to measure adoption? So this was quite challenging because it's not like we have administrative data on the use of reminder letters. So we had to set up a call center and spend a lot of time calling tax departments in these 1,800 municipalities to sort of survey and figure out who are the bureaucrats in charge of tax enforcement and mailers and so on, and then finding out from them, are you guys using these things? And then finding out, exactly what sort of letter do you use? What aspects of these letters that we taught the mayor about 2 years ago are being used, or 1.5 to 2 years ago. We're able to get about 80% of municipalities. It was a lot of work finding phone numbers, making endless phone calls. Things are very well balanced, so we don't have differential attrition. Even the people we're not able to get look quite similar. So we're not so worried about attrition. Our IV effect, so this is our TOT effect. If we instrument for attending the information session with your assignment to the invitation, we find 10 percentage point increases in adoption of these reminder letters. That's on a base of about 30%. So about 30% of the control group is using these letters. In the paper, we show the effects are going to look larger in proportional terms if we talk about the social norming language, because that was the part that was really novel to people. There, the control group base is much lower. Reassuringly, we get very similar answers from tax department bureaucrats when we call them, and actually from the mayor when we call them. There's a question about, could we find out the effects on actual tax compliance or taxes that were raised? So we haven't tried. So we think we're very underpowered for that. We never hope to be really powered for that. So see, this is a 10 percentage point IV effect. So this is like a 3 percentage point ITT effect. The effects in many of those papers are not about the total revenues raised, but are about getting them paid on time, or getting them paid more quickly. Those are not in the administrative data anyway. So we have sort of chosen to not really go sniffing for it because we just think we're really underpowered. Okay, intriguingly, 1.5 years or 2 years later, people remember what we taught them. When we elicit their quantitative beliefs about what do you think the effect would be of doing this thing, their answers are closer to the numbers we told them in our training session. And I think most interestingly to me, that's also true for the bureaucrats. So the mayor has gone home, has given that policy brief or had a conversation with his tax bureaucrats, and they're getting answers that are now closer to what the information session said. So there's been some flow of information, it seems, within the government. So I think that was made much easier, I'm sure, by the fact that we sent you home with a policy brief that you could call your person in the tax department and give them the brief and say, go do this thing. Okay, so to summarize this part.
Gautam, quick question. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my mind around what you're telling us has just happened. Okay, so mayors go to a workshop. You email all of the mayors who are signed up for the workshop, and you invite them. Ex ante, some are in treatment, some are in control. So yeah. If the control people respond, what are they getting from you?
Yeah, so control people are not allowed into the training session.
Okay, so they're in a different session altogether than on.
Yeah, so one question is, what are the control group doing, right, in that time? So we don't have amazing data on that. We try to schedule So the answer that I would bet money on is mostly this is schmoozing. This is networking and meetings.
Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time because I know, okay, so I just want to walk through this.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So some people who are invited come. I think you said like 34% of people
40% or so, yeah.
show up. Okay. That's going to hurt you, but you're going to do intent to treat. You give the information session, and now you're looking at outcome metrics. What I've learned is a lot of municipalities already send reminders, and it feels like that's what you're saying the control is.
30%, yeah.
Roughly 3 out of 10 are sending reminders already. And now 2 out of 5 are sending roughly reminders in the treatment group, in the intent to treat. And that's when you call them and say, by the way, you were in an information session, but you haven't given us the ones who actually attended the information session and the ones who didn't, because I have a feeling that even the ones who didn't, you're going to find a significant result. And I hope you use the same script when you called them.
Yeah,
we'll find.
I mean, of course, we're not. You know, when we're calling the tax bureaucrats, we don't mention anything about the information session or the like. We're not saying you attended.
Okay, but I still want to see the,
like
the 70% of people who didn't show up better have the same results as a control. Otherwise, I don't know what you're finding.
Yeah. I mean, I guess they don't have to have quite the same as the control, because there's some selection into attending. But that's right. So we can split this up by.
No, but right? I mean, you say you're doing ITT, so they better be distributed like the control, because you're assuming you're giving us ITT estimates that have no selection in them.
So these are, yeah. So actually, well, these are the TOT, but we also have the ITT. Yeah. I mean, we've of course also done the ITT.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, if they are indeed the group who got the information is now doing it more, you need to give us estimates on how the revenues have changed. Because now otherwise I'm just back to the demand world, and I'm saying, you know, your callers might not be blind to treatment, and or the people who are receiving the call say we better say because we actually sent somebody there. But you don't give a real, at least I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen a real outcome yet that we should care about that would go in tandem with your willingness to pay from your other studies. So maybe you can give me some results on the group who didn't show up, what they look like, and then also the group that didn't show up and did show up, their outcomes on actual how revenues changed.
Yeah, so a couple things on this. So first, the callers are blind to treatment. So the callers don't know if people, were treated or not. It's the same script. In fact, when we're calling the tax departments, there's sort of no mention of them having participated in anything like this. There's a bunch of obfuscation questions. So in some sense, we're doing best practice in terms of all the things you guys might have encountered or used in terms of obfuscating exactly what the survey is about, using the same script, blinding the callers. So we have looked at other treatment effects driven by the people who attended versus not, and I think yes, but I don't have those slides for you here today. What we don't have, and that was the answer I was giving, is looking at revenue. So we don't have great administrative data on revenues, but particularly not on the timing of revenues. You might get some annual data on did they raise local taxes, what share of the budget were local taxes. But what you guys had in the Halsworth et al. Paper, which is knowing from the tax authority exactly when people paid, like those data don't exist in Brazil in that form. So we think that's where the treatment effect would be. My argument is that I think we're going to be pretty underpowered for that. So we've not really been trying to look for it, but I also don't think those data exist because we'd want very fine-grained data on that. So I think what we're relying on here is these sort of, is these answers to blinded surveyors calling, often pretty low down or whatever people in the tax department, who I find it a bit implausible that they are like, oh yes, the mayor 2 years ago went to a thing, so I should say yes, but I guess we can't totally rule that out.
Gautam, can I just add one thing? So we also ask policy. So have you implemented electronic procurement in your municipality? Have you implemented like discounts for paying the tax? And in all those margins, there is no effect on those margins. So presumably they would be reporting, oh yes, I'm doing all these great things, including some things that we didn't treat them on. And so we are not finding effect if we run exactly the same specification on these other outcomes.
Yeah, so we have placebo questions and things like that. I guess the concern is it that the mayors told them if anyone ever calls, say that you should say that you're using reminder letters or something like that. Which I guess we can't totally rule out. We don't have, we don't think that's going on, but it would be nice to be able to show some sort of more real outcomes.
No, that's fair enough. So can you give us a flavor of what they're actually doing that's different? Are they now, they didn't have an apparatus to send reminder letters before, and now they are. They did send reminder letters before, now they're changing the content. They're now experimenting because they've learned from you the value of experimentation. What exactly is changing for these people?
So here's, actually there's a few interesting. So I think it's a bit of both. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but I think we can calculate those numbers of not having done it and now you're doing it versus, but I think a lot of the action is coming from changing the content of the letters. So, things like the social norming language is stuff that was most new. And that's where, you see the biggest effects. There's also a lot of, they modify the policy. So, the thing we showed them is sending letters, but like some of them will use other ways of communicating this information. So there'll be flyers in the newspaper, there'll be, so there's a whole bunch of different ways the information gets transmitted. And, so we show the results, different ways of measuring it. Here I've sort of we've tried to restrict it to things that seem most closely linked to the, the treatments we told people about. But I think it's a bit of both, sending letters when you didn't, and using things like social norm language when you used to send letters but didn't do that before. And we can decompose that. I think it's in the paper somewhere in the appendix.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Gautam.
So I'm almost out of time. So let me just quickly say a few caveats here, which is, by design, we chose here a really low cost and relatively apolitical policy. And one thing that's not clear from this experiment is like, did it actually matter at all that Holsworth et al. And 11 other RCTs existed? Could we have shown up and just said, here's a recommendation, do this, and people would have done it? We don't know the answer to that. How much did it matter that Puki Rio, Harvard, and Columbia were involved? Again, that's ex ante. I had concerns, so I think when I talk to policymakers in India, they often won't give me the time of day and think, look, you're some ivory tower academic, you don't know what you're talking about. But given that we have effects, we may worry that, having the Harvard and Columbia and Puki name attached to things is really not just the same. And if these guys were reading papers by themselves, which is not how the world works anyway, but the effects could be quite different. So there's lots of questions that I think this raises, but just to end with our initial motivations, we asked, do policymakers value learning about research and policy effectiveness? Does it change their beliefs and actions? And we provide some evidence that yes, they do seem to value it. They'll pay with their time, they'll pay with lottery tickets we endow them with. Does it change their beliefs? It sure seemed to in both studies, including for 2 years. Does it change their actions? Some reveal preference type actions in the first experiment, which I didn't get into much detail on. But also, policy adoption actions in the second one. And so at least in this case, some sort of information friction here was relevant. It was apparently a constraint on policy adoption, whereas we didn't find much evidence of things like term limits or the like affecting adoption, or even affecting things like demand for information. Now, there are many other open questions, like some of the caveats I mentioned, but more broadly, I just wanted to say very clearly, research affects and science affects the world in many ways, many of them very indirect. We are only studying one narrow channel, and we're very aware that there's many other ways that research can impact the world, and we think those are also very interesting to study. So I'll close there, and thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you, Gautam. That was fantastic, and thank you, Diana, as well, for answering all the questions. Just one quick question, and I'll pass over to John for the final question. Is take Gautam and Diana back to 2015 and 16. What would you do differently now? Like, what would you want to do moving forward that you couldn't do back then?
Well, we've just replied to referees, so we have many great suggestions of things we should have done differently. I mean, so one thing that would have been neat if we, I think it was frankly logistically impossible, but one can always, be more ambitious. One forgets many of the obstacles in the past. So it would have been neat to integrate these two experiments into one. You could have a group that gets invited and then variation in exactly what they got told. So, the gap that John, immediately put his finger on between the two experiments, it would have been nice to plug that. But I think it was a fascinating experiment to run because we were running everything by the seat of our pants. 2 days before the big conference, we still didn't know, will we get to do this or not? Will we get the list of participants or not? Will we have a room or not? How long will the room be for? Will anyone show up? So unlike so John and I, when we do experiments, we take like 4 years on design, 6 years on writing, 8 years, getting rejected. So they're older than some of John's children probably, but this experiment was not like that. We had a chance, you do the thing now, or you wait 4 years, and you don't find out anything until the day before the experiment. So I think we had a lot of logistical constraints, but we still wish we'd done better and integrated the experiments.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Gautam.
Yeah, I want to say that I think the science policy disconnect that I've witnessed sort of personally, I worked in the White House, now close to 20 years ago, and still working with policymakers today. I think that the most important problem in many worlds that we scientists face is this science policy disconnect. And I think the insights that you're bringing and trying to answer questions within this world, in a way, it's like the science of using science and the science of how to get science used. I think as economists, we've by and large sat in our ivory tower offices and said, we're going to do it and people will use it. And as anyone on the call knows, most people are probably applied. The secrets and information that is locked in journals. I was just thinking about this with a policymaker a few nights ago, that if we could have a group of people just unlocking those mysteries and talking to policymakers about all the great things, not only in economics, but in the broader social and hard sciences, the world would be a better place if we just stopped science and did that. And that's why I want to applaud both of you and your other two co-authors for going after this question, because I think using economic tools and what we can say to try to unlock these mysteries behind the science policy disconnect is meritorious. And I have quibbles with this study, and you heard a lot of them. I don't think that's the point. The point is rather, we can use scientific and economic tools to help enlighten these areas of discourse. And I think that the weakest part of the chain, of the discovery chain right now, is the science policy disconnect. And it might also be within the broader auspices of the political economy of decision making, that's where I was trying to push you at the end to say, okay, they're saying it, but do we get real results, and how did that work? That's an entire black box unto itself. But I want to say thanks for presenting. I don't have any more questions, and say that I hope anyone else on the call, that this is exactly where part of our research efforts should be going, because I think the science policy disconnect is just much, much bigger than most academics realize.
Cool. Thanks, John. So I think we'll finish there. Again, thanks Gautam, thanks Diana for that paper and presentation. That was fantastic. Next week we'll probably have our last virtual Advances of Field Experiment seminar for this year, at the very least anyway. Where we'll have Matt Lowe and Salma Musa talking about contact theory. So we'll have 2 presentations within the hour, and that should be a good talk as well. So thank you all for attending today and for asking the questions, and see you all next week.
Gautam and Diana, thank you, and everyone stay safe and healthy. Have a good week.
Take care.
Thanks a lot, everyone.